northern Spain is also what we'll be touching upon. And then February 19th, we have motorbiking across Europe with Scott McQueen. Scott and his partner will be sharing their experiences on motorbiking across Europe. And for tonight we have author Cillian Dunne. He will be sharing his story behind the writing of his book, The Right-Hand Man, about the experience of CIA-trained spy Carlos Whitgreen, who was a confidant of Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega in the 1980s. Cillian will describe his own experience in entering Panama as an outsider and earning the trust of the people there. Cillian is an Irish-American investigative writer and author of 6 books spanning fiction and nonfiction, known for reporting from high-risk environments. His work draws on first-hand fieldwork with prisons, intelligence circles, and political conflict across the United States, Ireland, and Latin America. And hosting him tonight is Andrew Medina. I'd like to welcome Cillian and Andrew to the stage.
Just as a protocol, if your phone is on, please put it on silent so we don't ring. You're going to see a drum roll and opening of some mountain scenes, and when we start this, we want rousing applause. And there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end, so don't interrupt the presentation until we pass the mic around. Thank you.
Well, now you've said all the things that I'm going to say, and now I'm just sitting up here like a rube.
I'm here to support you.
Hello and welcome everyone to the World Famous Adventurers Club of Los Angeles. My name is Andrew Medina. I am member number 1212, and I'm so glad to be your host for the evening. We got another great program coming at you tonight. I am joined by the one and only Cillian Dunne to talk about his adventures in Panama with the right-hand man of Manuel Noriega. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Cillian, welcome to the Adventurers Club.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to start by talking about you, because there's a fun little tidbit that I think maybe a lot of people may not expect. So talk to you for about 30 seconds. You figure out that you're not from around here.
Yeah.
And yet in so many pictures of you online and around, you're wearing a Boston Red Sox hat.
Yeah.
So what's the connection there?
I was I was born in Boston. I was raised there till I was about 4 to Irish parents. Oh, wow. And then my grandfather on my dad's side was sick in Ireland, and he said, let's move the kids back for like a summer for like a few months, and so we can be there. And then, for lack of a better way to put it, my grandfather took a lot longer to die than we thought he would. And my dad put us in school there, and one thing led to another, and they just really liked the fact that they were raising their kids in Dublin, in the same place they grew up. So they kept us there, and my dad would commute back and forth from Boston to Dublin for work.
Oh, wow.
But he'd do like 2 weeks in Dublin, 2 weeks in Boston. And yeah, so I was raised in Ireland, but I spent my summers in the US. So I was kind of raised in both places, and I'm a dual citizen.
Very nice. And you told me possibly one of the most Bostonian things I've ever heard, which is that you buy a new Red Sox hat and you wear it until it literally falls apart on your head.
Yeah.
And then you get a new one.
I do. Yeah, I wait till like the little strings like tether and people tell me that I look homeless. And then I buy a new hat.
So the book we're here to talk about tonight is The Right-Hand Man. And it is about your stories with Carlos Whitgreen. So this is not your first book, right?
No.
So how many books do you have before this one?
This is number 6.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And kind of, is there a genre or like kind of a theme that you like to explore in your writing?
I split it up. I started writing fiction. I wrote my first book when I was 21. I'm still like a young fella. I'm only 29, but I wrote my first book, fiction, 21. My second book was also fiction. And then I really had the itch to write like a nonfiction, like a true story, and I found one, and then I sort of stumbled into that. So I do like a healthy balance of like literary fiction, maybe with a little thriller and mystery thrown in, and then also something that is a little bit more investigative in nature. There's still, this book is still like it's a history nonfiction book, but there are like investigative elements here. So I like getting out there and interviewing like the people involved and getting into the dirty situations and whatnot.
Okay. And the one you had before this was, you were telling me about, it was with Bloods and Crips, right?
Yeah.
Bloods and Crips here in South Central.
Yeah, I met it was New Year's Eve, like 2022 or 2021, and I needed money, so I was bartending, and one of the security guards I got talking to, and he was a former Crip who had spent 15 years in prison, and my first question was like, why are we giving this guy a gun and a job, and like, why is he like guarding the party? But he was like a really, you know, interesting guy to speak to, and so I started talking to him a little bit more. I would call him, I would text him, he told me a story over the phone, and I quit my job. I actually quit like all of the work that I was doing, all of the money that I was making, so that I could interview him and other gang members from South Central Los Angeles about their prison experience in California's highest security prisons, or level 3, level 4 prisons, for essentially for murderers and people like that. So I wrote a prison book about him.
Very nice. And so you quit your job to go write that book, and since then, have you had a real job since then?
No, I haven't. I recently started ghostwriting for Forbes, actually, for like, you know, ghostwriting like people's stories and whatnot. But that's really only to pay the bills and allow me to do this stuff.
So you said something a few minutes ago that I thought was kind of indicative, which was you kind of stumbled into this story, this job. And I feel like, forgive me if I'm overstating it, but I feel like you kind of stumbled into this one too. So what was going on in your life when you picked up this story here?
Like I said, I quit my job to write the Bloods and the Crips book, and I released that in September 2023, and I had like a little author event on the Sunset Strip here in LA.
Very cool.
And it was my friend's party, and I like didn't sell that many books or anything like that, but my buddy had taken a picture of me selling books at the event. And a guy that I know that lives in Panama had seen the pictures, and he reached out to me and he said, hey, you know, I noticed that you sort of did something risky for your last book. Would you like to do something even riskier? And I was like, you know, sure, I don't really know anything about Panama. And he's like, well, talk to my business partner, Jose. He's an older gentleman than myself and my friend. He's in his 50s, and I was told that he had the connections to the inner circle of Manuel Noriega that were still alive. So I get on the phone with Jose, and I remember it vividly. I was like, you know, really scrapping together like the rent that I had. Like rent was due in like a week, like all that sort of stuff.
You were
And
in someone's pool house at that time, right?
yeah, I was living with the dogs. I was living in a pool house, and you know, I had to take care of dogs, and yeah, it was not a good time for my pride. But the call came through, and I spent about 30 minutes speaking to Jose, and he's throwing around all these names like Ronald Reagan, Bush, like Pablo Escobar, Noriega, Castro, and I was kind of hooked. I didn't really understand everything that he said, but he told me a very interesting, entertaining story that were like the high-level notes. And then at the end of the call, he didn't ask me if I wanted to do it. He said, when can you come to Panama? And I was like, I'll be there in a few days. And they bought my flight, and I flew like a couple days later.
What do you think it was about you that made him extend this offer to you?
I think, so I know for a fact that they had spoken to other writers beforehand, both Panamanian and American. The Panamanian writers that they had spoken to were arguably a lot more suited to the project than I was. They were of age, they lived through the era, but they were, one, lazy, they didn't want to do it for no money, and two, they were a little bit afraid, I think. Because there is like a certain fear that surrounds like the Noriega name in Panama, and I can speak to that a little bit more. But
it's different. I feel like when you're in it, you know, like you can leave at the end of the day. You can come back here. You can go back to Boston, Ireland. They can't.
Yeah. No, they're still there. So, I mean, I got the call, and for me, it was very much like an opportunity. A chance to sort of do something new, and then lastly, I mean, it's a really cool topic, and like it's really interesting, and both, I mean, now with like Maduro, it's timely, and I'm happy that I did it, obviously, but at the time I was like, you know, I'm dirt poor, like I don't know what I'm gonna do, so I might as well just do this, and I asked them to like pay my rent and all this stuff, and they did, so I went to Panama without sort of worry about what was going to happen to all my stuff in LA, and yeah, so that's the truth. I just thought it was a good opportunity.
All right, so at the outset, I'm going to ask, which one did you feel was more risky, the Bloods and the Crips book or this one?
This one for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, the Bloods and the Crips were easy in comparison to this. It really wasn't that big of a challenge.
Okay, so you have this conversation with Jose, you get down to Panama, and so you're there to meet Carlos Whitgreen. So
Yes.
who is, on a high level, who is Carlos Whitgreen?
Carlos Whitgreen is, on a high level, what he really was Noriega's best friend. Carlos's cousin was married to Noriega. They'd known each other since Carlos was 18 years old. From like a professional standpoint and from like a slightly more interesting standpoint, he was a triple spy. So he had been trained by the CIA, but he had also been trained by Mossad. He spent 2 years in Israel training with Mossad in the early 1970s. And then lastly, he was somewhat, I say he was ideologically trained by Fidel Castro. He spent a lot of time in Cuba.
Right.
And he would pass information between Cuba, Panama, and the United States. And he would sort of trade and sell information. So he pretty much was like a triple operative, but at the core of like his career and at the core of who he was Noriega's best friend, his right-hand man, and he was like a very influential person in the National Guard in Panama, which ultimately became the Panama Defense Forces when
Right.
Noriega became the dictator.
So you said something really interesting, which is a couple things in there that I want to get into. First one of which is that he was ideologically trained by Castro.
Yep.
What do you mean by that?
So a lot of these guys, a lot of these like socialist leaders in Latin America are like products of Fidel Castro's Cuba. In terms of it's like a two-pronged thing, right? It's socialism, communism on one side,
Right.
but on the other side, it's like anti-US intervention, right? And the way that Carlos saw it, and the way that he said Noriega saw it, was that Castro was the only person to sort of come up against the US and win. And what he meant by that was the US didn't get him in the end. He died of old age. They had reportedly hundreds of assassination attempts against him. So in terms of the ideology of like Panama being Panama first, he was very much trained by Cuba in that regard.
I see.
But that being said, he spent a lot of time in Cuba. He said that Cuban intelligence was great, and it's something that like isn't really spoken about that much. I can't speak to it really because I didn't go there and I didn't interview all these people. But he said that like at this time, Cuba was like an iron trap, like nothing could get in or out. And Noriega himself sort of tried to adopt that with Panama, and Carlos, by extension, adopted that ideology too.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. So you are driving from the airport to meet this guy. You know some of this stuff about him, maybe not in as much detail as you would, but you know generally who he is. What's going through your head as you're going up to that first meeting?
I mean, I was like shitting my pants, pardon my French, but I didn't even really know Jose. I land at night around 9 p.m. I go from the airport, Tocumen Airport, right to Jose's apartment. He lives in a very nice part of Panama City where like all the banks are. So there's a bunch of high-rise buildings and kind of looks like Miami, like it's beautiful. But I show up, it's late. Jose had just driven from this town called Petití, which is like 6 or 7 hours away from Panama City. And, he gives me a debit card and he's like, go to this hotel. He's like, I'll see you in the morning at 7 a.m. Come right back here. We're going to meet Carlos Whitgreen. So I go to my hotel and I didn't sleep at all that night. I think in the book I make like a connection to this thing that I had read about how like when you're in a new and unfamiliar place, you feel like you're prey. And like that there are predators around. It's like a natural human instinct. So that's how I felt. I felt like prey. And so I wake up the next day, I go to Jose's apartment, and we go meet Carlos for an early lunch. And on the way there, Jose's really not telling me that much, except for the fact that he's very well known amongst a certain age group and demographic of people in Panama. He's not necessarily influential anymore, but he is somebody who is he will contest you, like he'll come at you and he'll make sure that like you're sort of in the right place when you're speaking to him, because this guy was sharp, like he could scan you up and down, and this is what Jose told me. So he basically just said, don't screw up, like make me look good. This is a guy I really trust, so we got to make sure he trusts you if you're going to write the book.
And I imagine when you're sitting in a room with this guy, you're kind of aware on some level of there's like kind of bigger forces maybe at work here. What were some of the forces at work that you were thinking about in that first meeting?
Well, we got there and he sort of is speaking Spanglish, right? He's like, he's doing that intentionally so that I feel a little bit more involved. Now, at the time, I spoke better Spanish than I do now, but I kept it a little bit secret that I could sort of understand a little bit of what he was saying.
Smart.
At the same time, I think he did the same thing. I think that he spoke perfect English, but he was pretending like he couldn't, so that he could listen to Jose and I speak and sort of spy on us.
He's like Shohei Ohtani.
Yeah, it's like a common, it's common like espionage technique apparently, but so he was, speaking Spanglish, and it was very like cordial, like we weren't speaking about anything serious, and then Jose said, Cillian is interested in being the writer of your story, and Carlos turned to me and he didn't say anything except for, you will do a good job. So I was like, oh my God, I will do a good job. I don't plan on doing a bad job. So
is that an encouragement or an injunction?
It was, yeah. So it was obviously it was a bit strange, and going through my head, I was like, oh shit, like I'm really in it now. Like I can't back out. But I was really excited too, because I truthfully really liked him when I first met him. Like he was really cool, like very fun, really energetic. Like he was like an old bull. He was in his early 80s, but he had so much energy and he was so fun. And yeah.
And yeah, I mean, like, did you feel like he was kind of sizing you up when he first met you? Like, what do you think he was looking for?
I think he was sizing me up a little bit. I think he knew immediately that I wasn't, necessarily a threat, both just because of like how I look and who I am, and I'm a young guy, like coming to meet him. But Jose had grown up in that world. So Jose's father was like a member of Noriega's sort of inner regime. Right. Like a gangster, right? Like a narco gangster. And Carlos had known him for a very long time. So there was implied trust, right? If I screwed up, the first person that would have gotten, a punch would have been Jose, not me.
Gotcha.
But I would have caught one second for sure from this guy. But there was implied trust. So there was just enough trust to really get going at this point.
Okay. All right. And so he starts... This is not a spoiler, I don't think, but the structure of this book, it kind of goes back and forth between your perspective of writing it and then really like kind of a first-person perspective of him, of Carlos, living through various times and various sort of events in his life and in Panamanian history. So I guess, what was the first story that he told you? And like how did it sort of impact you?
We started backwards. So when we first started our interview process, I asked him about the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989. Right? I was like, I started backwards. So I started at what I thought was like the climax or the high point of the story, and we worked back. Obviously, like you read the book and you know that like there's like a spoiler there, but like Carlos wasn't there for the U.S. invasion of Panama. There was a little bit of like a tragic event that happened during that time, but we started there and we worked our way back, and I did that intentionally because I had to actively learn as much as possible, like while I was doing this or while I was in Panama. So not necessarily behind Carlos's back, but like I had to corroborate all this stuff and interview a ton of people down there, including like people who were like former CIA assets who would report intelligence back to Washington, and then also like journalists and people that were in opposition to Noriega, which Carlos didn't necessarily fully know about. So he was telling me his stories, and we started wide and then worked our way down narrow. Yeah. But yeah.
And so like, what was your strategy coming in? What was your plan?
It was kind of like I saw it as like a fishing net. I just wanted to like throw a giant fishing net in the ocean and see what I could get, and then from there like sift through it. I had a big timeline built out before I went. I did it really quickly, and actually before I went to interview Carlos for the first time, I met with a really well-regarded journalist down there, an American guy named Richard Koster, who was a journalist for Newsweek during Noriega's regime, but he was also a CIA operative, and he had been in Panama since the 1950s, so he had a lot to say. And he sort of helped me lay out this big timeline before I met with Carlos. And then through that fishing net, and I just tried to like paint the numbers and fill in the gaps. And then as I became more comfortable with my own knowledge, then I started to contest him on certain things and try to like, see what I could do with the narrative.
Real quick, do you have that picture of you and Koster? Because it's in the book, right?
Oh, I do, yeah, but I don't have it on the thing. I apologize.
Gotcha, no worries.
Yeah.
How do you push back against a guy like that? Because this is a guy who, I mean, just from the details that you give in the book, This is a guy that grew up fighting. All right, he was like, and like every time he like kind of encounters a slight a more than slight inconvenience, usually one of the first reactions is a punch to the nose. So how do you push back against a guy like that, even though he is in his 80s?
It was it was tough. It took a little bit of balls. Carlos himself described himself as a guy who doesn't read between the lines. He tears the lines apart.
Yes.
Right? That's like the perfect way to describe him. So he was very much an aggressor, but I picked my battles. He would say a lot of stuff, and then I would transcribe it, and I'd sit with it, and I'd study it, and I'd do my research, and I'd try find like corroborating evidence. I gave him the benefit of the doubt for a lot of what he said, but when I caught him in a lie, I would contest him. I'd say, well, this is what people say, or like this is what's online, or this is what I read. But Carlos was the kind of person that like doubled down on the first thing that he would say. So I learned that really quickly. Like in 1981, the dictator before Manuel Noriega was a guy named Omar Torrijos. He was like a left-leaning socialist, borderline communist dictator in Panama. He died in a mysterious plane crash in 1981, right? And you hear that, and you're kind of like, okay, somebody was behind this. But
Did it explode in the air?
So I asked Carlos, and when I met with Richard Coster, he told me that there were eyewitness reports of the plane exploding in midair, right? And then also Noriega's second in command in the Panama Defense Forces, this guy Diaz Herrera, publicly declared to Panamanian media and then ultimately American media, I think the New York Times, that Noriega had planted a bomb on the airplane, right? So I hear all this stuff, and I'm like, I have to ask Carlos like what the real story is behind this. And I asked Carlos, and he's like, oh no. He's like, no, you're wrong. The pilot, he flew into a mountain. And I'm like, okay. An experienced pilot flew into a fucking mountain like that. It just doesn't make sense, But I would contest him on these facts, and then he would always come back at me. But he'd always have one little detail.
Yeah, that you couldn't account for.
One little detail that I couldn't account for, and I couldn't contest him further. So I make it, obviously you read the book, I make it known in the book that like, if there's something I really can't prove, but it's really interesting, I say that.
Right. Because in that one specifically, I remember he says that, the pilot really didn't want to fly because his wife had just had a kid and he wanted to be there for him, but like he didn't want to leave, but like, Noriega's the man, you got to do what he says. So he was just distracted that day, and he crashed into a mountain, I guess. Yeah,
and it's kind of bullshit, but at the same time, Noriega had a memoir written in the 1990s. An American journalist named Peter Eisner went to visit him in jail in Florida multiple times, and the book is essentially like a giant transcript of their conversations. And Noriega does tell the story word for word the same way that Carlos does. So I don't know how much that means, because maybe Carlos is just sort of, it's like ingrained in Carlos, and that's what he thinks actually happened. But they do tell the same story, and I don't have anything else to prove other than what like Coster and journalists say, but there's no real evidence.
In all the stories that Carlos told you, what were what's one that like really stuck with you, like really like impacted you and changed the way you kind of move through the world subsequently?
That's a great question. It doesn't necessarily change the way that I move through the world, but Carlos told me that after like the Iran-Contra affair sort of like spilled into public media in 86 or whatever, 85, 86, the narrative around Noriega really started to change.
Yeah.
And Noriega sort of noticed this, right? They knew what was happening because there were like indictments and public accusations and whatnot. And what they decided to do was they started to strengthen their intelligence with sort of other nations and other superpowers in order to sort of not threaten the US, but to sort of say like, hey, we don't need you. And not that I take any of this stuff, but it's just things I would have never thought about. So like, for instance, before the US invasion of Panama, like Noriega felt really threatened because of all the stuff that was happening and like domestically and abroad. So he sent people to China to negotiate a deal with the Red Army to put Chinese troops on the Panama Canal, which I was like, that's crazy. But then you look at what's happening like recently and today, and Chinese companies are buying up like the ports on either side of the canal, and then BlackRock recently came in and bought them back. And, it just goes to show like how heavily contested this area has been for a long time. But Noriega understood that, and he took advantage of it. And also, at this time, he was like having phone calls with like Muammar Gaddafi every week in Libya, and he was like taking advice, and Fidel Castro. And it just, like I said, like it doesn't change my life, but what it did was it made the world feel smaller. and how like these like major leaders like really truly are like it's all just negotiation, which
Right.
might sound really naive, you know, for most people in this room, but I was a young guy like going there, and not that I had like this, you know, romanticized view of the US, but I literally, like I grew up in Ireland, like in the Irish education system, and our teachers would say that the United States is the big brother of the world. And that was like an ingrained notion that I held going to Panama and like doing this whole thing until it was broken, until I realized that like what it really was just control.
Do you have an older brother?
I have a younger brother.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then you know what older brothers do to younger brothers.
Yeah, exactly.
When I feel like there's kind of a secret third character in this relationship between Carlos and Noriega. It's almost like a throuple of like there's Carlos, there's Noriega, and then there's the canal.
Yeah.
And the canal creates all these kind of issues for the both of them because everyone wants to get at the canal in some way or another. So how does the canal factor into Carlos's life and Noriega's sort of time in office and political career?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Panama as we know it really only exists because of the canal.
Yeah.
So Panama gained independence in 1903. They were, you know, part of Colombia before that. And in the late 1800s, the French started digging the canal. It's a 50-mile stretch from Caribbean to Pacific. So they sort of recognized the importance of that or the opportunity, and they started digging it out, but they stopped, right? And then 1903 comes around, the US send troops to help Panama gain independence from Colombia, and they do. But the reason was that they wanted to resume construction on the canal and dig it out. So they did, and then in the mid-1910s, the canal is completed, and the U.S. It's a militarized like U.S. asset, like it's an American territory. They call the people that are born there and live there Zonians. They're not quite Panamanians. They're not Americans.
Interesting.
They're
Okay.
Zonians, right?
Huh.
And they're military people or the children of military people. So. Fast forward to the 1960s, 1970s. Well, after 1968, Noriega becomes the chief of intelligence under Omar Torrijos, and with Torrijos, everything was about the canal, because Panama's greatest asset is something that they don't own, right?
Yeah.
So Omar Torrijos is a socialist dictator, or was a socialist dictator, who was Panama first, and it was sort of his goal to not reclaim, because they never owned it, but to claim the Panama Canal.
Right.
And they weren't able to do that until 1977, until Jimmy Carter and Omar Torrijos signed the Canal Treaty. And then they agreed that by the year, January 1st, the year 2000, it would come into Panamanian hands.
Yes.
So it was a huge, politically in the 70s, it was like the major focus for Torrijos and his sort of regime to claim that.
Right.
But with Noriega in the 1980s, it was important because, one, the US government knew that they were going to lose it eventually. And they sort of, like Reagan especially recognized that Jimmy Carter kind of made a bum deal. Not that he did like a bad job or anything like that, but nobody saw the benefit to the United States of getting rid of the canal. So Reagan comes in and not that he makes like a huge push for the canal or anything like that, but it's sort of back of mind. And then his VP is George H.W. Bush, who was director of the CIA in 1976-77. Very close with Manuel Noriega at this time, and he was the director of the CIA, I think, either right before or during the Canal Treaty negotiations. So, you know, by the time the 1980s come around, the canal is just, it's being watched so much, and they basically just don't trust Noriega being like the one in charge of it, or the one that's going to become in charge of it when it ultimately transfers over to Panamanian hands.
Sure. So I want to talk for a second about, I want to get a little bit into his relationship with Noriega, but I want to talk about your choice of words for the title, right-hand man.
Yeah.
Because I thought that was so interesting, especially as I went through it, because right-hand man, it's not a position, right? It's not like vice president. There's no like legal weight to it. It's not best friend. It's not like, it's what makes someone a right-hand man, and what do you think made Carlos the right-hand man of Noriega?
Blind loyalty. Blind loyalty, right? And that's like the honest God truth. And I had that sort of, I guess I had that idea like while I was interviewing him, but then Carlos's own children were like, we fucking hated Noriega. They were like, we did not like the fact that Noriega was that Carlos was so close to Noriega, and we felt that Noriega took advantage of our dad. That's what they said, right?
How?
By just getting him to do things that Carlos like shouldn't have done or wouldn't have done in the first place. So one of those things is after, I'm not sure what year, but after, I presume after the Canal Treaty was signed, but the early 1980s is when I imagine this would have taken place. But in the 1980s, the CIA prohibited Noriega from traveling to Cuba, right? In the 1970s, he was sort of able to. He was actually sent on missions to Cuba to negotiate with Castro on several occasions, but in the 1980s, he wasn't allowed to. And on top of that, he wasn't allowed to do business in Cuba, right? So what he did was he would get Carlos to do business for him, right? So Carlos essentially would put all of these assets in his name and all of these businesses in his name when it was really Noriega running it. So Carlos was almost like a proxy for Noriega in terms of like the business that they would do together, which was illicit by nature, right? So yeah, I mean, blind loyalty is the correct answer, I think, with Carlos. But when it comes to, I guess when it comes to like the actual duties of like a right-hand man, he was also like a highly trained spy. You know, he was a member of the National Guard and ultimately the Panama Defense Forces. He was somebody who was like equipped to sort of be by Noriega's side. But the difference between him and like a bodyguard or like another sort of member of the military or political figure was that Carlos like actually kind of cared for him, you know, because they were, they've known each other for a long time.
Sure.
And
So I guess that, do you believe he was Noriega's right-hand man?
I do, but I think that what I think is that he was taken advantage of by Noriega. But I think that Carlos saw it as like his life purpose to protect Noriega as well.
Yeah. Okay. So you're getting into the thing that we talked about. I want to read here. So I took an excerpt. I took a picture of this excerpt from the book because I think it is the most purest distillation of the relationship between Carlos Whitgreen and Manuel Noriega. And just, if you'll indulge me for just a second. Men would overthrow each other men would overthrow each other and rise to the throne, only to be ousted by a younger man with dreams of power. I vowed to always be by Manuel's side. He was my brother, my greatest accomplice. I would do anything for him. He enabled my life. Without Noriega, I don't know where I would have been. Jail, overseas, famished. Manuel and I kept each other in check. I was his guardian. He was mine. Together, we were ready to take on the challenges that swarmed around us, inching closer day by day. Now, this occurs, it's not a spoiler to say that there is an assassination attempt on Noriega's life. And this sort of, that description comes right after this, which I feel is appropriate, right? Because it's like the very first time in the book where like there's like a really explicit assassination attempt on Noriega's life. And so it feels like Carlos in that moment was really thinking about like what he meant to him and like what losing him would look like. So what do you think, I guess like, can you talk a little bit more about like what you saw in that relationship and how it sort of, you know, propelled Carlos through his life?
Well, without Noriega, Carlos wouldn't have been any of these things, right? Carlos met Noriega at a family party in his hometown. Oh my God, I completely forget. Chitre, and he meets Noriega in his hometown, and it's at a family party, and Noriega is dating Carlos's cousin, who he ultimately ends up marrying, right? A woman named Felicidad. They nicknamed her Muñeca, cow, for whatever reason. I asked Carlos, and he's like, we just thought it was funny. Yeah, but anyway, they meet, and Carlos is about 10 years younger than Noriega, and he's completely in awe, right? At this time, Carlos is a bit of a, you know, he's like the black sheep of the family. They are, you know, they don't know what to do with him, and Noriega takes him under his wing. Noriega, at this time, actually works for the US Army, and he's soon joining the National Guard when they meet, right? So Noriega takes him under his wing, and then the coup of 1968 happens where the National Guard essentially starts ruling the country. And Omar Torrijos is the one in power, and right by his side is Manuel Noriega, and then under his wing is Carlos Whitgren. So this happens. Noriega's relationship with the CIA it intensifies in the early 1970s after this coup. Noriega tells a story in his memoir of like the first time the CIA sent him to Cuba, and it was 1971 to negotiate the handover of a CIA asset that Castro had kidnapped, basically, or had taken into jail and was holding him ransom and whatnot. And Noriega goes and he negotiates the handover, presumably giving some sort of intelligence to Castro. But either way, Carlos is right there. And Noriega is the one strengthening all these relationships with these various leaders or intelligence agencies. And at this time, Carlos is being trained by the National Guard. And then Noriega introduces him to the opportunity of going to Israel to train with Mossad, right? So Carlos goes to Israel and he's trained by a man named Mike Harari, who ultimately in the 1980s, apparently he retires from Mossad and he becomes Noriega's advisor in Panama. He moves to Panama. Actually, right before that, technically, he becomes the station chief of Mossad in Latin America, but he retires. But he takes up residence in Panama, and he becomes like a little birdie on Noriega's shoulder, sort of like giving him advice and information and stuff like that. He trains Carlos purely because of his relationship with Noriega. And then the newly formed DEA in the early 1970s is looking for Latin American assets, and Manuel Noriega, surprisingly, is actually a leading voice in the topic of narco trafficking and curbing narco trafficking in the early 1970s. Given the way things turned out, it's hard to believe, but there's like evidence of it that he was like a leading voice. And in 1973, the DEA asked Noriega to send up a bunch of agents to Washington to be trained, and Carlos was one of those. So without Noriega, like, there is no Carlos. If Noriega had never met Carlos's cousin and by extension met Carlos, like, Carlos probably just would have been, drinking at a bar and like hustling people at pool and getting in fights all the time, or like cockfighting and stuff. Yeah, cockfighting.
God, there's a lot of cockfighting.
There's a lot of cockfighting. Yeah. But yeah, it was because of Noriega that Carlos ultimately became who he was, and Carlos recognized that like through and through. Like, that's why I think he was so blindly loyal to Noriega, because he sort of knew that Noriega gave him the life that he had.
Yeah. What do you think? Okay, I want to give Carlos a little bit of credit here, because he's not just like some dumb thug. He's not, because he like kind of got caught a little bit, but he could have got caught for a lot more than he got caught for. So like, and he did have these opportunities in Israel, in the DEA, in Cuba. Noriega sent him on those missions. He personally like dispatched him. What do you think it was about Carlos, having met him, that engendered that kind of confidence from Noriega?
Carlos himself described that sort of dynamic as so Carlos said he's like I'm like a dog. He's like, when Noriega points, I bark. Right? So Carlos himself saw himself as like somebody who was like a dog that like an attack dog.
But an attack dog can just attack. It just attacks, right? What Noriega asked Carlos to do was quite a bit more sophisticated than that. It wasn't just go and do this thing. It was get training, develop relationships, bring this back. It was high level stuff. So like, what do you think? What else do you think was in there?
I think Carlos was like an extremely instinctual person. He very much shot from the hip. He was somebody that I think his first instinct was sort of always maybe a little bit of trust to a certain degree, but he was somebody who just went with his gut, right? And he was somebody who had this sort of radar or like sonar, whatever you want to think of it as, where like as soon as the atmosphere would shift, Carlos would be locked in on that immediate thought, right? So it's very instinctual. Yeah. In terms of his sort of like ability to act as like a spy or like anything like involving espionage, he was loud and he was boisterous, and that's why like his time in Cuba wasn't quiet. It wasn't subtle at all. Like, he was cockfighting. He was hanging out with people that he wasn't supposed to technically be hanging out with.
Right.
But that being said, the way that it worked for him and the way that it worked for most of these people in Noriega's inner circle was that truly at this time, for a long time, the CIA and the DEA needed them more than they needed that more than Noriega and Carlos needed the CIA,
CIA.
DEA, and that was purely because the war on communism or the threat of communism was so great during the Cold War, and then by the time the 1980s sort of spilled around, the war on drugs was just huge. The creation of the Medellin cartel in the mid 1970s really changed the playing field for the United States, and that's why the DEA was formed in the early 1970s, because they recognized it as a problem.
Sure.
So Carlos, he was fortunate to be in a lot of these positions, I think. Intellectually, he was pretty brilliant, but he really was, first of all, a product of Noriega, and then secondly, a product of the training that was introduced to him by Noriega.
Right. And, kind of sort of building on that, the training, that he got from Assad, from the DEA, so some of the very best. And also, these are very important relationships. So I feel like also he kind of acted as, in part, as sort of ambassador to these places, and okay, what's the face of Panama? It's obviously someone who is capable enough to undertake these trainings and represent himself and his country in a good way.
Yep, it was a small circle of people that were trusted with this kind of thing. For instance, Carlos was very much like a liaison to Cuba.
Yes.
He was very close with Castro. He claimed that he owned a restaurant with Castro in Panama.
Bodegita.
I couldn't find proof of that, but the stories were cool. And then even I met Manuel Noriega's brother, Chiro Noriega, and he was in Hong Kong and he was with the Chinese, and Noriega specifically planted him there. He was an ambassador, but he was strategically put there. So all of the sort of nations where they could and where they could potentially strengthen their relationships, Noriega would put a lot of emphasis on that. And those countries were very much the UK, Israel, China, Japan, and then of course the US. But Noriega was the connection to the US. He was the one that they spoke to.
Yeah. And so when kind of going back to this sort of blind loyalty aspect, you said something in another interview that really struck me, because Carlos was present when Noriega died, right? Noriega kind of died on the operating table trying to remove a brain tumor, right? And I think you said, I don't think it's in the book, but I think you definitely said that in that moment, you believe that Carlos wishes that he could have given his life so that Noriega could have lived another 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Carlos himself said that to me.
Yeah.
He, there was one day, and I was terrified, by the way. This was very early on. And he breaks out this bottle of it's called Seco.
Seco.
Seco. It's like a clear liquor that they really love in Panama, and it's great because it doesn't give you a hangover and you can drink it all day.
I now love Seco. I've never had it, but I now feel like I love it because of the description in your book.
It is awesome. They mix it with agua de pipa or coconut water, and it just, I don't know what it does, but it keeps you hydrated and it gets you drunk, and it's crazy. And but anyway, Carlos and I had been drinking since 9 in the morning, and it was in the evening, and he starts crying, and he starts and he really his heart's on his sleeve, and I'm sitting there and I'm like, holy shit, this this guy who has very much been responsible for a lot of killings is really crying in front of me, and I have to really play the part and figure out how to get where I want to be here, and he just he really started spilling. He was just I miss him every day. He's every time I see he's thunder and a storm, he's I think of Noriega, and he's he explicitly said it should have been me. I wish that I was here during the US invasion of Panama so that I could have given my life for Noriega. And then I asked Carlos's children about that, and I was your dad said this yesterday, was he just drunk, or was he telling the truth? And they were oh no, he really feels that way. So the reason why Carlos wasn't in Panama during the US invasion is because his son had gotten into an accident in Switzerland at a boarding school. So Carlos goes to Switzerland, and then a week later the US invasion happens, and Carlos scrambles to find a way back, but he can't, and he blames his son. He blames his son for not being in Panama during the US invasion. That kid has grown up a really tough life because Carlos really felt so strongly about that.
It's interesting, he talks about, I loved all my children, I was always there or I was there as much as I could, I gave them access to everything that they wanted, they had access to the best education, I was such a family man. And then that's it. And then you don't hear about them for another 50 some odd pages. And I just thought that was sort of until that story, where he goes to Switzerland to be with his son, and then
Yeah.
the U.S. invades, and then Noriega gets arrested, and he can't see him anymore until basically like he gets to prison in Florida, right?
Yep. Yeah.
And that's like the longest single passage about any of his children
Yeah.
from his perspective.
I
in
really
the
hope-
entire book.
I really hope the children don't happen to be watching this or like see the recording or anything, because what I'm about to say is it is the truth, but it's not something that they like I've ever said to them. But he didn't talk about them at all. It's almost like he didn't give a shit. It was like he had like 8 children with like 6 different women over the course of 40 years.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like he really didn't care. Well, he said he did, but his actions proved otherwise.
Yeah.
And his children, they sort of like they all grew up like a little bit strange, like a little bit. It's hard to describe exactly because there's nothing wrong with them, but they're very like they were very like codependent on their father, and he would very much like sort of control their lives, and to the point where his eldest son was like in his 50s or 60s, and he still lived like right down the street, and he couldn't do anything without Carlos's approval. So, yeah, it's kind of sad, and I didn't want to like do I didn't want to like make that a thing in the book, so I tried to emphasize them as much as possible without like writing something that Carlos never said.
Right.
If that makes sense.
No, I get you. I get you. No, that's how it comes off.
Yeah.
That's how it comes off.
Yeah.
And I guess that sort of gets me into like the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is this is a man who is 80 years old. He knows his time, and like this is his probably last best opportunity to get his story out there, and Noriega's story too. How did you go about siphoning through the information that he gave you and picking out what is sort of like airbrushed a little bit versus what's a little bit more genuine?
Yeah, for a fact, he lied to me a whole bunch. I knew that. It was it was pretty obvious. He's embellishing facts and he's saying all these crazy things. But I essentially I take everything and I write several drafts of the book, and then I have people review it. So I have people who were present during the U.S. or during Noriega's regime in Panama in the 1980s, and journalists in Panama and whatnot, and they sort of tell me what they think is true and what's not, and then I like A/B test it almost, and then when I have a firm understanding of the overall timeline and the history that I know to be true, then I can start sort of contesting Carlos and or corroborating or finding evidence to disprove him. So what ultimately ended up happening was there was a major in Noriega's Air Force, a guy named Jose Hilario Trujillo, who sort of considers himself like a historian now. He's written a couple books about Noriega and sort of this time. And
did he give you all the documents? That
he
are
gave
in
me the
here?
documents,
That's
yeah.
right.
And
There's
that's
a
what I
whole
was
bunch of
get-
documents that are in there, folks. It's really, really cool. Like,
So-
it's worth reading just for that
Yeah.
and everything else. But yeah,
No, it's
They're cool.
true, yeah, and because Carlos's story is great, but I'd written it straight out, like I said, in a couple drafts, and there was a lot of truth to it, but there was a lot of bullshit too, and people were like, no one's going to read this, and even if they do, they're going to give it 1 star, and like you're going to become a joke. So I I had met Jose Hilario Trujillo, and I knew that he had all this research, and then we sort of hunt him down a little bit, and he has 481 pages of documents that I guess were previously confidential, but they were all owned by Noriega at one stage. And what they do is they show sort of a different narrative to the one that's been presented, forever.
Yeah.
And what they are for the most part, they're letters of correspondence between administrators of the DEA and Manuel Noriega from the early 1970s right up until 1987. And the reason why I thought that they were so important is because there was actually the 60 Minutes interview in 1987 where they went to Panama and they interviewed Noriega. And they did so. They did so sort of knowing that they were going to, kind of smear him. Like he hadn't been indicted yet, but he had been like loosely accused of all these things.
Right. This is on the downswing now.
Yes, but so anyway, the reason why I say it is because in that interview, the interviewer goes to Noriega's office, and Noriega opens up this little black book full of documents, and he essentially tells the camera and the interviewer, he's like, this is my collateral for when they come to get me. And those are the documents that I own, and I put them in the book. And they're letters of correspondence, administrators of the DEA and Noriega, and that interviewer from 60 Minutes, after there was like a cut in the video back to the studio in New York or LA or whatever it was, and he said, we actually spoke with the current administrator of the DEA, John C. Lon, who had written Noriega letters that were in this black book, and they asked him about the letters, and John C. Lon was like, oh yeah, he's like, oh no, he's like, I wrote those. He's like, Noriega's like our biggest asset. He's like our biggest help. And the interviewer said, there's a very good chance that if Noriega does stand on trial for the crimes he's being accused of, that the administrator of the DEA will be on the podium in his defense.
Wow.
Which is interesting, right? Because he was convicted on, narco trafficking, racketeering, money laundering. So the documents were really important because they framed the narrative a little bit different. Like Noriega, I still believe, was guilty of all those things. You know, I spoke to other journalists and other people who had stories about him, and even a couple people who had like 1 degree of separation for people who had testified against him in court. Oh, wow. And I believe it. You know, it's easy to believe, but but there is, there's a lot of history behind that, and I wanted to understand like that turning point where Noriega was a friend and then he became a foe, and that turning point was like the Iran-Contra affair.
Yeah. I want to. How much time do we have? Okay. I want to talk about your. Well, actually, no. I want this one other thing. Your journalistic integrity is above reproach. From this interview, from the book itself, and from the other interviews that I've watched. Like, you really do go out of your way to like fact check and corroborate, and if you aren't sure about something, you will make sure to say like, I don't know if this is true, but like I believe that it is, or like I believe that it isn't, right? Was there anything? What were some of the things that didn't make the cut, didn't make the book that you couldn't corroborate?
There's a really awesome one. That's a good question.
Yeah. All right.
So I couldn't corroborate this, but I really wanted to put it in the book. There's a rumor that Noriega was really into witchcraft, right? And so in Latin America, like I'm sure some people have heard here or know, people that have been to Cuba or whatever, but the like the Santeria religion and like Babalaos and stuff, like it's quite common. Like what is it, like Afro-Caribbean religions, right? And not that this is what like Noriega believed in, but a lot of the guys that I met in Noriega's inner circle had Babalaos. Like they basically had like that connection to Cuba and the Santeria and the religion and whatnot, whatever. I know that's not witchcraft, but regardless, there's a lot of rumors out there that Noriega used to make his inner circle take blood oaths. And they would, go to secure locations and they'd do blood oaths and they'd swear their loyalty to him. And then when the U.S. Army came in during the U.S. invasion of Panama, they claimed that they found all of this stuff, like this witchcraft stuff in Noriega's home and whatnot. But I don't think there's ever been any like photographic evidence or whatever. So I couldn't put it in the book. But
it does sound like a convenient smear.
It's a convenient smear, but I also kind of believe it. I kind of believe it as well, because Noriega was like that. And people in Panama, especially of a certain age and demographic.
He was like what?
They are people who I don't want to say it because it sounds so high level, or like it sounds like I'm glossing the surface when I say he believed in witchcraft. But there was no religion, but there was no like atheism. There was a belief in something, but it wasn't necessarily, And there are a lot of people who are like that. There, it's sort of like a weird like in between belief,
right?
And it falls within that line of witchcraft. But that's just me saying that, and that's probably my ignorance saying that. But it's very similar to what I learned about like the Santeria and like the sort of Afro-Caribbean religions that are still present today. But that's something that didn't make the cut because I didn't know enough about it and I couldn't prove it. But yeah, if it was true, he made Carlos take a blood oath, and maybe that's why Carlos went to his deathbed, sort of backing him up. And yeah.
Did you ever ask Carlos about it?
Yeah. He got so mad. Oh my God. He said, that's fucking stupid. He's like, why would Noriega do that? And Carlos said that a lot. I was like, the first thing I asked him was like about the drug trafficking, and Carlos was like, why would Noriega traffic drugs? I'm like, well, fucking, he was convicted of it and there's all this evidence. And he just really, I'm sure like it's something that, like we were going to get to, and I'll say, but Carlos's motivation behind the book was preserving his legacy.
Yeah.
You know, he was an old man. He knew he was going to die. Carlos is dead now. He died last March, and he saw this book as a way to preserve his legacy. And I went into it, yes, young and like a little bit naive, but I knew that I was young and naive. I didn't want to just take everything at face value. That's why I spent so much time doing this stuff and so much time down there and interviewing all these people and traveling to all these places. Yeah. And I didn't want to just like write the words of some delusional old man who's only remembering history from his side. I wanted to write like a balanced view of what I thought the narrative should be when people speak about Noriega, because it's still very one-sided when people speak about Noriega. Sure. So I wanted to contest that a little bit using Carlos's story.
Apart from Carlos, like who were some of the people that, I don't know, like still were down with Noriega, you know, like who still were just like, okay, like maybe he was kind of bad in some ways, but like okay in others. Like were there any people like that? Only
people that were like in his inner circle, or people that were members of the Panama Defense Forces, and it was a really small group. And the majority of people that I did interview and would meet, especially journalists, were like, no, like one journalist said, he was about my age, and I met up with him, and he said that in his home in La Chorrera, which was an area that was bombed by the US during the invasion of Panama, said if you even bring up the name Noriega to his mom and his grandmother, they start crying. You know, there is a lot of hate, and that sentiment still like lingers through till today. Yeah. But part of the reason is because the education system there, like, it isn't brilliant, and it is sort of influenced by the American schools that are like in Panama City or like on the canal or whatever it is. But the international schools like have a lot of influence there, and the IB program, I forget what that actually is called, but it's like a thing that's sort of becoming a lot more popular around the world, like
international baccalaureate.
Yeah, maybe that's it. Yeah, and that's becoming really popular in Panama. But the material that people read and the material that people study are like American textbooks that are sort of looking at it from one side. So so that's partially why. But Noriega was like a dictator. He was a terror. You know what I mean? Like in 1987, 88, like he had his own SS, you know, like I forget what they were called. I think the Greyhounds or Dignity Battalions. Yes, yeah, the Dignity Battalions. They were basically like the SS. They were like his private sort of SS, and they would go and they'd like screw around with protesters and journalists and whatnot. They actually burnt down La Prensa, which is like the headquarters of like the main newspaper in Panama. So I mean, he was a terror. People hate him. Yeah, you know, people hate him.
I mean, it's. I think it's really telling that, you know, you have this guy who is so loyal, like blindly loyal to Noriega Carlos, and then just 1 degree of separation, 1 degree down. His kids can't stand him.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, they some of them, I think, maybe don't care anymore. Sure. But the ones that do care were basically like, you know, I love my dad, and he was taken advantage of by him, by
terrible
Noriega.
By Noriega, who is bad. You know. What do you think Carlos would think reading your book? Like if he were to read it now, like if he was still alive, what would he think if he read it?
I walked a really fine line with this book, so I'm going to be contested. I am contested on both sides, right? I'm contested in Panama too, and yeah, which is interesting. So I think Carlos would have probably initially been defensive about some of the stuff that I wrote, in particular my chapters, right? Where I'm like, this is bullshit. I don't believe a single word that he's saying when he talks about this. Right. He would have come at me and he would have been like, oh, no, this is true. Like, why would you have written this? But I was prepared to do that. And I had people on my side in Panama that were sort of in our little circle and that were going to back me up. That being said, like on the other end of the coin, there's a lot of people like Panamanians who read the story and they're sort of traumatized by it and they just don't believe a word that Carlos says and I think that no matter what, it's going to be polarizing.
Of course, yeah.
But Carlos's opinion, it didn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things because it's not his memoir. I don't want to preserve his legacy. Like, yes, I probably was faithful to a lot of the stuff that he said, but like I very much, like I explicitly said, I was like, this is what Carlos told me. As entertaining as it is, and it is entertaining.
It's entertaining.
It might only be like 70% true, you know.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's a great moment in the book where he's in this hotel room with this woman, and he gets this knock on the door, and there's like this little kid outside, like delivering his newspaper, like, oh, like, Senor Whitgreen, like, here's your newspaper, and also I just wanted to come up here and talk to you because you're a great boxer, and I want to grow up to be like you one day. You're the pride of Panama. And this kid was Roberto Duran.
Yeah.
Which, if you know anything about boxing, Roberto Duran was like an absolute, like, one of the top boxers in like the 90s, 80s,
Yeah.
80s, 90s.
Yeah, I think he has. This could be a fact that isn't a fact, but he might have the longest or like the greatest longevity of any boxer in professional history. Like he fought in several decades. I know that, and he fought right up until like 2001 or 2002.
Yeah.
But there is a picture somewhere here in the slideshow of me with Roberto Duran, and I met Roberto Duran at a bar several times. He always hangs out at this one bar. It's like a Galician restaurant on this one really busy street in Panama City. And I explicitly asked him about Carlos. He's like, "Oh, Carlitos Whitgreen, yeah, of course." And he knows him, and
Sure.
and Roberto Duran's dad used to like gamble with him at the galleras and cockfighting,
cockfighting, yeah.
and whatnot. And so there is the connection there. But Carlos's ego and his machismo,
Right.
the way that he remembers it is like, oh, Roberto Duran, like he came to me first before he became champion of the world. He came to me looking for boxing lessons.
Exactly.
And,
He wanted to be like me boxing.
yeah, I didn't believe it, but the story was entertaining, and the connection like still is there. And I asked Roberto about it, and yeah, he didn't remember like being a kid and like asking Carlos that, but he did. He has known Carlos for like a really long time.
Yes,
and
I believe
yeah,
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just yeah. There's a lot of little moments like that, but that one I think was the first one that really like kind of like flicked me on the nose. I was like, all right.
Yeah.
Not everything in here is 100% real.
Yeah.
What are some of your projects that are coming up? You're working on a couple things.
Well, I have two. One I'm actively working on for about a year now, but it's a slow burn.
Slow burn.
It's because I'm, raised in Ireland. I'm really interested in Irish history as well, and I've never really written an Irish history book or like nonfiction or anything like that. So I met a guy a few years ago, and last year I started writing a story. But his name's Nicky Kelly. He in the 1970s he was falsely accused of being a member of the IRA and robbing a train. And in 1970s Ireland, I'm sure people know, like in Northern Ireland, the Troubles were quite prominent, and Catholics versus Protestant, Britain, Ireland, whatever. Nicky Kelly was somebody who was thrown into prison without trial. His judge actually fell asleep during his trial. It's very like it's sort of like a folk tale in Ireland at this point. Like it's not, you can't even really look it up. But the sleeping judge. So Nicky Kelly goes to prison in a terrorist prison because the IRA were terrorists at that time for the Good Friday Agreement, and he goes on hunger strike for 37 days and all this sort of stuff. So it's really, I mean, it's not to call it like par for the course for like Irish IRA stories, but there are a lot of ones similar to it.
Yeah.
But I've known him for a while. I just really like trust the man. I think like I think he's brilliant, and I think he's sort of he's a member of like a dying breed, and I want to get a story out there before he dies because he's in really bad health, and that the hunger strike like really took a toll on him. And then that's a slow burn, and then there's another one potentially coming up through people in Panama that introduced me to the opportunity. But there was a drug smuggling pilot back in the 60s and maybe early 70s, and I still don't know the timeline, but he allegedly used to smuggle marijuana with Jimmy Buffett into Florida, from what I've been told, and he got caught by the feds, and then he faked his death, and he moved to Australia in the
in the northeastern part of
Australia, and he became a saltwater crocodile tour guide in a little forest, and he lived in like a tree hut, and he recently died, but his wife is apparently open to someone telling the story, and they have a connection to one of the guys in Panama who was the son of the Panamanian ambassador that was in Sydney. So there's like a small connection there, like one thing leads to another, but that will probably be the next thing. I'll be going to Australia to live in like a little tree hut for a month, which I can't wait to do. It sounds pretty awesome. So
that's going to be awesome.
Yeah.
That's going to be a great time. Well, Cillian, thank you so much for joining us. The book is called Right Hand Man. We have, I think, 5 copies. We have 4 copies on the back table, and then this one right here, if you'd like to purchase it for $30. I'd love to take some questions from the audience if anyone has any. So if you do, please raise your hand and we'll get you a mic.
Start with Chuck here. So I spent time in Cuba and actually went and participated. We didn't participate, but I sat in and filmed the Santeria ceremony.
Huh.
And it's actually pretty interesting. And it's a kind of a combination of Catholic and indigenous ideas. And the family that I stayed with, the woman, she would make costumes. There's 4 different levels for male and females of the Santeria. And she would sew these little costumes up to make extra money for this. And so when I filmed it, it was basically, I heard this drumming going on across the street. So I went over there with my stuff, and they said, come on in. And I sat down, and there was this is a shaman guy who was singing and chanting, and a couple of drummers, and they had like a little icon that he was kind of chanting to. And these people were dancing in a circle around there, and there were children walking around. And so in one hand, they had a cigar, in the other hand, a glass of rum. And so they danced for quite a while, and this went on. And all of a sudden, one guy kind of fell down. He sort of went into a trance. He was kind of shaking and stuff, so they picked him up and calmed him down. And then after a while, he got up again and started dancing. So, I mean, it's all over the place. And it's not considered evil witchcraft so much as the traditional indigenous ceremony. So anyways.
No, that's, yeah, I did want to, like, when I was speaking, I made a point to say that perhaps it's my ignorance sort of assuming that, but that is sort of what I was told by people in Panama. And I'll go one step further to tell like an interesting story that they were talking about the Bay of Pigs, and people were theorizing. Obviously, this isn't fact, but they were essentially saying that like the Kennedy curse, as we know it, was put on the Kennedy family by Babalaos, and that's what these people genuinely believed. And so I hear this, and I'm like, whoa, that's pretty heavy stuff. So
Honestly, if that's their evidence, I buy it.
yeah,
Like, yep.
I'll just follow up on this a bit. I'm from Brazil, and again, there is a lot of this Santeria there. We call it macumba, and it's very interesting to see the spectrum of Christianity and the Santeria and the blend, and people who sort of can hardly distinguish between the two. So it's not considered like witchcraft. And there is a very interesting old movie, I think in English it's called The Promise Keeper. It won the Palme d'Or in Cannes, like in the 1960s. And it very much goes into the story of a man who is simple and, kind of naive, but, he really believes in both. And it really gives you a good understanding.
Another hand back here. Anybody else?
So I'm curious, during your time with Carlos, did you have a lot of liberty to go explore and do your own thing, or were you just sort of at the mercy of like, you're going to hang out with us this entire time?
It's a really good question. So the trips were split up. The first trip we were in the middle of nowhere. We were in a place called Chumico. It's on the Pacific coast of Panama, maybe like a 7-hour drive from Panama City. I think the region is Los Santos. It's nobody really lives there, but couldn't go anywhere because there was nowhere to go, no service. I just had my recorder, and then I would transcribe the recordings and translate them when I got into Wi-Fi later that day. And the second time I went to Panama, I stayed in Carlos's apartment with him in Panama City, and he wouldn't let me leave. I actually wasn't able to leave his apartment unless he was by my side. And then one day I was like, Carlos, like, I need to go for a walk or something. Like I'm cooped up, and he made his girlfriend like trail me the entire way. So she stayed like 10 feet behind me as I walked along the Cinta Costera, which is like this. It's like a bayfront sort of walkway in Panama City, and like a really nice part of the city. But oh yeah, I couldn't leave his side for the first 2 trips anyway, and then the third trip I was able to have like my own sort of space and then come and go from interviews. But yeah.
With the reflection of hindsight, you talked about how Carlos had this blind loyalty or an extraordinary devotion to Noriega. It seems like there's a lot of that in the world in different ways and in different times. We're probably seeing some of it right now. Is that something that you felt was unique to him, or were there a lot of other people that you met in Panama that had that same devotion to Noriega?
I did meet other people that. So, for instance, Carlos's apartment was in like the heart of Panama City, and like twice a week he would host breakfast where members of Noriega's PDF would come over and have breakfast, and they'd just reminisce on the past. And they were old men who had nothing else to do but talk about the past. They would sit there for hours and just talk about Noriega, and they'd talk about all the injustices and the betrayal and this and that and whatever, and they can't let it go. And these are men who are firmly in their 80s now. Like Carlos is dead now. A couple of them are certainly on their deathbeds, but it's been nearly 40 years, and they can't let it go. It's all they talk about, to the point where the guy, Jose Hilario Trujillo, who negotiated the handover of the documents that are in this book, like, this guy, like, he just doesn't do anything else with his life. He had opportunities to do it, even like stepping into politics, because people that were in the PDF and Noriega's inner circle, like, they were able to break through that and step into politics as the dictatorship ended. But these guys like Carlos that were firmly loyal, like, they don't do anything with their lives. They're kind of gangsters. I don't know how they make their money even to this day, but they spend a lot of their time just talking about the past. And yeah, absolutely. But Carlos just happened to be closest, I think.
Was he the cult leader that they all pointed up to, or was there anybody else that sort of took Noriega's place in gaining their leadership?
No, after that, no. A big reason why the U.S. invasion of Panama happened is because the election in 1989 saw this guy Guillermo Endara win the presidential election, but Noriega gave it, I forget the other candidate's name for some reason, but Noriega essentially skewed the election and gave it to this other guy, and then people started protesting, and then a couple months later, the US invaded, but nobody assumed his place. Guillermo Endara was the rightful president. He became the president after Noriega was extracted, and then from there, I mean, nothing has really changed, since the early 1990s.
So many questions I want to ask. But you mentioned you don't know where the money comes from. And most of my questions here is, how could Carlos keep the assets without getting burned, indicted by the DEA himself? You mentioned he killed many people. Did he do the killing, or was he a classic spy master who'd hired thugs and had enough distance he didn't get caught? And lastly, is the School of Americas in your book at all? The alleged spy training facility we ran down there.
It's not alleged.
Did they train? And tell us more about this training. Just what training did he get from the Mossad and the Yankees?
Okay, so a lot of things to answer. I'm going to start with School of Americas. So Noriega was a product of the School of Americas, as well as a school called the Trios Military Academy in Peru. Okay. In Peru, that's where he was first recognized by the CIA. He was sort of hand-selected. He was top of his class. Noriega also attended the School of the Americas, as did a lot of intelligence assets that were sort of recruited into the CIA. To what extent, I don't know, but I can make a pretty good estimate that, like, they were being heavily monitored. Like, every single person in every classroom was being watched, and who can help us and how can they help us. When it comes to Mossad, the training that Carlos told me about I was surprised by it. It wasn't as intense as I thought it would be. He told me some stories that I thought were kind of bullshit, some were interesting. What it really sounded like to me was that Mossad wanted friends in as many places as possible. In order to do that, they trained them and they had influence. So Noriega was a friend of Mossad, specifically this guy Mike Harari, who was Carlos's trainer while he was in Israel. Mike Harari ultimately ended up becoming quite an important and influential figure within Mossad after the Munich Olympics massacre in 1972. Mike Harari was the leader of the hit squad that was put together. If you've seen like the Steven Spielberg movie Munich, Mike Harari is actually a character in that movie. And then the Lillehammer affair, where like the waiter was wrongly killed and he was mistaken for like one of the terrorists. Mike Harari was actually sort of the one given the public blame for that. So that training, it's a little covert. Like, I don't understand it fully, but what it truly was, the purpose of it was for Mossad to have friends in Latin America. Noriega understood that having friends in Israel and the Middle East was also quite important for him, because come the 1980s, a lot of weapons are are being seized by Palestinians and transported to Panama and Nicaragua, especially to the Contras. And that isn't something that I just like made up. Richard Coster, the journalist who I spoke about earlier, told me that, and that's in the book too. And then, I'm sorry, you asked a few questions. What was?
How did he keep the money?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, so I asked him explicitly, why were you at Noriega's drug trial in Florida? And if so, why weren't you someone who testified? Carlos gave me a bullshit answer. He's like, yes, exactly. He's like, the reason why I wasn't there is because they knew Noriega was innocent of drug trafficking and I would have proven them wrong. That's bullshit. Carlos operated many businesses with Noriega under Carlos's name. A lot of those assets were seized. For instance, Carlos and Noriega owned these 2 yachts called the Macho 1 and Macho 2. You know, what kind of guy do you have to be to name your boats that? But they owned those boats and they were seized by the DEA after Noriega was extracted. So a lot of stuff was seized in terms of like cold hard cash. You know, Carlos was a gangster, right? He exploited people. For instance,
killing, or did he have other guys do it?
Yeah, oh yeah, and that's another thing. So in the 1970s, he actively told me that he did the killing, but he framed it as doing it for the benefit of Panama. He was a member of the National Guard. There were opposition to the government and whatnot. In 1970, in 1968, the coup happened where Omar Torrijos becomes the first true dictator of Panama. 1970, these units are put together, the Tigres and the Pumas, and their job is to go after political opposition around Panama. And Carlos called them bandidos, but they were just political opposition, and they would murder them. There's a whole chapter, it's chapter 5 in the book, where they talk about hunting down these guerrillas and these bandidos, and it's a really cool story. But yeah, he talked extensively about killing people, but never true political assassinations. I don't think that he would have been the one to do them in the 1980s. The reason why is because he was being monitored by the CIA, and you can look up CIA documents even on Google, and they explicitly mention Carlos Wickering. There's one really good one where it says it's from the early 1980s, and whoever the agent was that was typing up the document was like, this name, Carlos Wickering, keeps coming up in a lot of conversations. We really need to look into this guy. And they did, and they knew how close he was to Noriega. And Noriega also knew that because he had rats in the CIA and in Washington too.
Well, thank you, Cillian. Well, thank you, Cillian. Thank you, Cillian, for joining us. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for joining us. And for the folks at home, if you like what you saw here tonight, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. It helps us out a ton. And if you're in LA, why not come on by? We do this every single Thursday, and you can meet our amazing speakers in person and ask your questions from our live audience. That's going to do it for us here at the Adventurers Club. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time off the beaten path. Good night.